Why is writing TV better than writing movies?
Television is the place for innovation now. It's the most exciting area for people who want to create originally. I know that's in contradiction to the tradition, where people thought, well, independent films was me expressing my voice and my idea. Actually, television has so much opportunity now that there are many, many ways to tell your story or to tell any story. And I think just the plethora of opportunity is part of what makes it great. The other thing that makes it great is that you can do the long narrative. That in writing a movie, if it's a 2-hour movie, your story really has to end in 90 minutes or 120 minutes, or even if it's a little bit flexible from that. With television, you can tell a 6-hour story, an 8-hour story, a 13-hour story, a 26-hour story, or a story that lasts 100 hours. And that means that you can expand vertically. By that, what I mean is not that the plot goes on, but that the depth of character is something that you can continue to reveal. And secrets keep coming out over the many, many hours of a show. And it's a different kind of creating. It's a little bit more like life, in the sense that life doesn't end in 2 hours, or it doesn't end when a plot comes to the point that something concludes or finishes. It's the continuity of experience, and all of that is some of what television offers now.
And then I guess the only downside would be that you would have to test your story to make sure that it does have legs to be more than 90 minutes.
Well, in creating a show, an episodic television show, as opposed to, for example, a movie for television, or even a limited series, in doing a longer series, what you need to do is conceive of it at the beginning to make sure that it has legs and springboards. And by that I mean that the story has a potential to continue generating other stories as it goes along, mostly propelled by the characters in the cast. Springboards also means that each episode, whether it's an hour or a half hour or whatever length it is, needs something that springs it forward. Whereas in a movie you might have, a continuous plot that starts with, whatever the inciting moment is at the beginning, has a certain number of plot points or changes, and comes to a conclusion. And that's really too simple for what television is. So the complexity is something you bring to it from the very, very start. It's not something you find later.
How is writing a television show different from writing a movie?
Writing for television is faster and more specific in terms of getting the internal motor going for the characters. The process, if you're on an actual show, does have to do with deadlines. You have to write fast enough that if you are doing multiple episodes of a show, that you're on schedule. So the idea of the artist in the garret waiting for a muse to strike is not going to work if you're writing for television. You really have to turn out the work. I find that that's actually energizing to the creative process rather than deadening. I think the idea that somebody is waiting for what you have and that there's just that little bit of pressure on you to deliver sometimes helps you actually get to work and to pull out what you need to do. Writing for movies, I don't know how much this industry even exists anymore. There are two ways that people write for movies now. One is that you're on a blockbuster franchise, and that's writing, but it's writing to a formula that is somebody else's. And it is also means you're part of a team, which is essentially director and producer driven, or sometimes even star driven, so that the chance for you to exercise your creativity is within those parameters. I wouldn't say it's gone. It's never gone. You can always give whatever you can and bring whatever you can to the story and the characters. But I find that, to me, that's limiting. The other kind of writing for movies or theatrical features is the indie process. The indie process is not a business. The indie process means you need to finance your own material and you go to the art festivals. The end product of doing indie films is that you might get hired to work on television because there is not much business there. In other words, how many people are going to see some small indie film unless you can get it on Netflix, because now the boundary between what is a movie and what is television is certainly graying, if not eroding completely. Almost all of the premium outlets are doing what I call the shorter form, which is the 2-hour form, or even 90-minute form, as well as much longer. In fact, things are in all sorts of sizes now. You can get a half hour, you can get an hour, you can get 2 hours, you could get more rarely 3 hours or 4 hours, but they happen. 6 hours for a limited series. 8 hours is common for an entire season. 12 and 13 is common for an entire season. There are no more 22-hour seasons, really. And then it goes on to the next year. So you might easily get 36 hours of storytelling on television. In a movie, you have the time that you might need to do your work. If you want to spend 3 months or 6 months or 2 years writing one film, you can do that because it's your own, unless you're being hired. In other words, if you're just doing your own personal movie. If you're being hired, you're back on your schedule again, and the next episode of, Batman or Spider-Man, if you're so lucky to get on those big franchises, is due at a certain date.
So it sounds like then really the only way the artist can sort of be their own driver and sort of work, as you said, in this garret waiting to be discovered, is an art house type film, because television or tentpole movies, it's by committee in a sense.
No, actually. Yes, if you want to do art house films, anybody can do that. You're in the fundraising business. If you do that, you must understand that it is, in a sense, less free because so much of your time is spent raising money and then marketing. But no, I think that the most artistically creative thing you could do is an original television series, or even a certain series that may not be yours, but that give you a great deal of freedom in terms of evolving the characters and the storylines. If you look at something like Atlanta, Donnie Glover's show, or you look at something like Handmaid's Tale, which is, of course, based on a book, or any number of other things, Orange is the New Black, the list is long. There is very little in the theatrical feature arena that is as incisive and challenging and original as some of the work on those shows. So to me, now this is just my own bias. I know there are people who feel differently. My own bias is that for originality, creativity, and exploration, you really can't beat what's happening on television now in all of its forms, if you increase it to really all of the forms.
But one maybe should test themselves. How well do they work in groups?
No, I mean, yes. If you're on the staff of a show, if you're on a staff, it is collaborative. That's true. If you're so fortunate as to be in a writer's room, you will be around a table all day, every day, with 4 or 5 or 7 or 10 or however many you have, fellow writers and producers, creating material. You then go off and do your own individual episode and bring that back to the room. So in that sense, it's a little bit like a writer's workshop, where yeah, you get the general structure of what you're supposed to do for that episode in the group. You go do it. When it comes back, you're going to get notes from collaborators. You hope, and in the best shows this is true, that these collaborators are all building together to make your episode shine. So there should be, ideally, no sense of competition or, tearing anybody down. It's all a matter of in service to the best possible work and in service to the show. And ultimately, yes, the showrunner's vision. But not everything is like that. If you look at the work at Phoebe Waller-Bridge, whether that's Killing Eve or Fleabag or other things she's done, for the woman's point of view, coming alive on screen, I can't think of anything anywhere that delivers that quite as well as she has done with her television series. Well, if you look at something like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, Vince Gilligan's worlds that he has created are so character-rich that it doesn't even matter if these guys are drug pushers or criminal lawyers or whatever. We love them, we're rooting for them. And that is such a strength, and it comes from the writer.
How fast do you have to write a television script versus a movie script?
Generally, if you're on the staff of a show, from the time that your outline is locked, now we're talking about a process until you get that outline done. So there's been a pitch, there's been a story discussion, there's been a structuring, there's been an outline, there's been a revised outline. So starting from that moment, which is at that point weeks in, you might have 2 weeks or 3 weeks to write a script, depending on the show. That's the traditional rhythm. But there are shows that package up entirely before they ever shoot. And if they're going to do it a whole season in advance, you might have more time. A movie script, if you're doing it on your own, take the rest of your life if you want. I mean, who cares? But again, if you're working for a producer who has commissioned it, you will have a deadline. The deadline might be, depending on the nature of it, you might have a month or two. But I find that students, especially writing first scripts, need much longer. My students who write scripts at USC might take an entire semester of 4 months to finish a draft, and then another semester of another 3 or 4 months to polish that draft. That's luxurious, and it's because they're students and they're getting feedback. If you work at that pace in the industry, I think they'd be considered very slow.
And is that something that your students are very aware of, that it is actually, you're giving them more time than maybe they would have had they be?
Yeah, no, they know. They know, and they're, you can tell them, but that's different. It's one thing to be told. It's another thing to be in the midst of the world where somebody says, okay, go home, I want to see our first draft in 2 weeks. And, are they going to panic? They shouldn't panic. If they have the tools that they've been given, you can easily do an hour in 2 weeks. When I was doing those kinds of things, my pace was always that I would, if you think of an hour as being maybe 28 scenes, maybe less, depends. And if you think about it, if you write 2 scenes per day, and that's not very much, really, that's, maybe 4 to 6 pages per day, it's all you're writing. But if you do that for 14 days, at just even 2 scenes per day, you've got your 28 scenes in 2 weeks, and you could do it faster. So it's not a burdensome schedule really at all.
How does a writer decide if their story will be more effective as a film or a television series?
All stories that mean something to audiences are based on human beings. there is no storytelling that is not character driven. So the special effects approach, whether that's superheroes or fantasy action adventure, might be fun for a big screen and the audience, which tends to be adolescent boys. And if what you want to write is special effects laden fantasy action adventure or any other kind of big action panorama, you're much better off with a movie, if that's what you want to do. But if what you want to write are stories involving human beings and their relationships and their issues, whether that's personal or political or whatever it is, or historical or contemporary, if it's based from character, I don't think you're going to find a lot of takers in the movie industry on the studio level, because what used to be small films or personal films or dramas, character dramas, are not easy to finance because they don't know how they're going to make their money back, unless, of course, maybe you have a big star involved. But even in that case, the star world is no longer what it used to be. There aren't movie stars that can drive box office like they used to be. So I really think that if the question is deciding which to write for, it's what is it that you want to write.
So you don't think that there's a modern day Cary Grant? I mean, we just watched.
No.
No,
I don't.
No.
I mean, there are names that you would know. I mean, Tom Cruise is currently being called the last movie star because he's trying to, reboot his flying movie, Top Gun, from the 1980s. I guess 1980s it was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
More than 30, about 30 years ago or so. We'll come see him now because they're recapturing their youth. I don't know how many of those people are going to the movies, honestly. If you look at somebody like Zendaya, which is from Euphoria on HBO, now she has a following. Now she had a following first as a musician before she did as an actress, and then Euphoria is capturing a certain feeling about high school life, which is not accurate. I have my own ideas about Euphoria, but nevertheless, It is very successful. And she is a star. But she's a star that did not ever work in movies. She's a television star and a big star, and a bigger star than many of the other names you might see out there. There are wonderful people who are still around, Jane Fonda, for example, and Lily Tomlin doing that wonderful Grace and Frankie. But that's television.
Sure. And that was based off a movie, wasn't it?
I don't remember the origin of it, but a lot of things that are on television are based on books or on international materials.
Has film versus television evolved further from each other as time has gone on? Let's say it's how the popularity of streaming has emerged, and then the cinema experience, for whatever reason, has maybe gone away.
The cinema experience has certainly changed with the closure of theaters. That's partly pandemic related, and it's partly financial, and it's partly that why go spend that much money for the tickets and the parking and the dinner and the babysitter, if that's something that happens to you, when you could wait a few weeks and it'll be on Netflix or Amazon or something else. So I think that I noticed that nearby the Landmark Theater just closed in the West Side Pavilion. So exhibition theaters are really getting to be more like theaters for plays, where there's special events, or theaters for concerts, special events where you're going out for the night and you're spending a lot of money because it is an experience. On the other hand, the opportunities for exhibition on television have increased of movies. So, in that sense, they're coming together. The only thing is, there is a difference of the viewing experience between something in a dark theater on a large screen and something on your home screen or even your computer screen. Televisions and homes, in terms of convergence, many theater screens got smaller for a while so that you could have, smaller theaters in multiplexes at the same time as home television screens got bigger. So they're almost the same size, almost the same experience. That's changing a bit now as the small screen multiplexes are going away. They're just not a much of a business model. And more people are watching on their computers, even on their phones. If you're watching something, whether it's a movie or a television show on your phone, it's a very different experience because the kind of information you're getting on a screen that size is different, and it tends to complement the experience of intimacy with a character and be not good for panoramic storytelling.
Although I have to say personally, nothing beats like a Sunday matinee with maybe 3 people in the theater.
Well, that's wonderful, but imagine it from the theater owner's point of view.
I understand.
Those 3 people are not paying his rent.
I know. In fact, we're probably a drain on their, we're probably a negative.
Well, they're closing for that reason.
Yeah.
It may be luxurious in the same sense as any private screening is luxurious. If you talk to the Theater Owners Association, they're all in woe.
Sure. Yeah, hopefully, though, somehow we figure out a way, or it becomes fashionable again in some sense.
Well, I think it will always be there as an experience in the same sense as going to the theater, going to a concert. But that puts the pressure on showing blockbusters or special events of some sort, and it makes it even harder on the small independent personal film, which will have, very, very little in the way of an audience. So those films will do fine on television because actually, if you're dealing with the small personal indie film that tends to be character-driven anyway, well, that's what television is. And there's no reason that people can't tune in for something that is just 90 minutes long, and they do.
Your book right here, this is something that's required reading for some of your students?
Oh, it is required reading throughout the industry. I sometimes go into offices and I find this on executive desks, and sometimes I've heard that the mentorship programs for developing new writers on television are requiring this for the mentees coming in. And yes, my students all read this at USC. It's kind of the Bible of the industry for how to write for television. And this is the 4th edition. The reason it's the 4th edition is that television keeps growing and changing. The very first edition of this book came out in 2005, I think, and you can imagine how different the world was. That was before streaming, and it was out of date on publication. Every few years I do another version. This is the end of 2018, and after this, more has happened. So this book has everything in it.
Great. Yeah. So when you were writing it, I guess Netflix was mailing out DVDs.
No, 2018. It was after that.
I meant the first. I'm sorry. I should rephrase that. Let me rephrase
the earlier one. No, and Netflix wasn't even mailing them out at the time. The only thing in 2005, there was still the 4 legacy networks is all, plus HBO. And HBO had only been in business, 4 or 5 years. AMC was doing some very interesting things, but Breaking Bad hadn't yet come on. And everything changed after that. Everything changed. There was a 4-act structure required in 2005 of everything, and that has changed. So the world has moved on in fascinating ways.
You say that once streaming hit, it changed everything?
Streaming changed everything because it allowed people to make more choices. It also allowed more production. It also broadened the idea of the structure of television because way back in the earlier 2000s and before that, everything was in a 4-act structure on television because it had to allow for advertising every 13 minutes or so. So you would divide your 60 minutes into roughly 4 acts, roughly 4 15-minute segments. They weren't really exactly 15 minutes, but something like that, so that there could be a commercial break at the end of each one. And then there was a teaser. Generally, the traditional structure, which I'll tell you, is a teaser. Well, let me start that again. The traditional structure was the show's title with even a theme song. Then sometimes there was a small commercial even right away. And then there's the teaser, anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes, which literally teases the action, or sometimes in a procedural would give you the crime or the case to be solved. Then there'd be a commercial. Then you'd go into Act 1, which would go to roughly 18, 20 minutes, 18, 20 pages. Then there'd be a commercial. Act 2 would go to roughly 30-ish pages. This is traditional. Act break. Act 3, which is the worst case, the climactic encounter, would go to roughly page 45-ish. And then Act 4 would go to the end and would be slightly shorter, would probably be 57, 58, or 55 minutes. And then there'd be another act break and another commercial. Then it got longer, and in 2006, ABC decided that they wanted to go to 6 acts in order to stick in more commercials. And so you ended up with a very long Act 1, so the people wouldn't lose you, and then they break Act 6 into Act 4 into 4 and 5, and then there would be a tag after the final act, which sometimes led into the next week, and they would get more commercials in. And this just got worse and worse and worse and worse, where there were some shows on traditional networks that had almost more commercial material than dramatic material. And people got fed up. One of the things about streaming is that there were no commercials. The minute there were no commercials, you no longer had, not only did you no longer have that structure, but you had actually more airtime. You had more flexibility of telling stories. Now, HBO always had no commercials, and the same was true of Showtime. Now you can get AMC with or without commercials, but I watched Better Call Saul the other day as it ran on television as opposed to seeing it streaming, and I was appalled that this wonderful storytelling kept being interrupted by trying to sell me something. And the same thing's true of Hulu, where you could buy it with or without commercials. You just pay more if you don't have the commercials. I can't imagine watching Handmaid's Tale, disturbed every several minutes by selling me something. And I just won't watch anything that way if I can avoid it. So that's part of the big change. It changed structurally, but it also changed the kind of material. And it changed the way people watched and the number of choices people could make.
And I'm sure that encourages binge viewing if there's no commercials because you're so set in the story.
Well, you can also continue because you know, and they know, the purveyors of these absolutely know that, I think Amazon does this, that after you finish an episode, there's a little ticker thing that says, next episode starts in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Like, no, I don't want to watch. I sat here long enough. But it's very easy to be glued for a very long time. And by the way, this disabuses the notion that young audiences have such short attention spans that they will only watch something that's 3 minutes or 10 minutes long. It was discovered, because it was tried on YouTube, what would happen if we gave people the option of watching 10-minute acts, that is 10-minute segments, or and have 12 of them to make a 120-minute movie, or to let them look at all 10 one after another, after another, after another. Everybody watched all 10. So it's just not true. It has to do with interest and attention. It doesn't have to do with something's wrong with the brain of young people who can't pay attention for more than a few minutes. If they're interested enough, they're there.
Sure, and I mean, if you have your morning coffee, I'm speaking more for myself, I'm going to be more ADD and switch around than if it's later in the day and I'm tired and now I don't have anything more on my plate. My attention's going to be there. So
yeah, well, one of the things about streaming is you can watch it at any time. I mean, if you're a morning viewer, you could see something that would normally have been an evening show at any time in the day. Years ago, when West Wing and ER were on, and they always started at 10 p.m., I knew I was going to be watching from 10 to 11 at night. I would rather not watch from 10 to 11 at night, and I would rather see those same shows at 9 or any other time. And now I can.
one last thing, you had said the tag. Forgive me, what is the tag?
Oh, in terms of structure, after you get to your final act, in some shows, not all of them, there's a form where there's an act break or a break of some sort, and then there's more dramatic material. And that extra dramatic material is usually quite short. It might be 1 scene or 2 scenes, maybe 3 scenes, but not really much longer. And either it does something as a commentary on what that episode was about and twists it, or it just simply starts introducing what's going to be on the next episode. Every show is different. You don't find this sort of thing very much on streaming, and so we're really, when we talk about act breaks and the 4 or 5 or 6 acts, or the number of acts plus a teaser and a tag, we're really dealing with traditional legacy television.
Can you tell us about the 4-act grid?
In my book here, there is an extensive conversation about, maybe I could find a page here somewhere. Here's a picture of it, and it says using the grid. And I find, and here is the non-grid analyzing structure from a different point of view. All right, there's some other things. You can find it in the book. I found that even after the traditional 4-act structure was abandoned by networks, that as I talked to people who were writing for Netflix or HBO or any other form at all, Amazon, when I talked to seasoned writers, they were all still using it and just dropping out the act break. And the reason they were using it is that it works. It works as a storytelling mechanism, even if it does not need to be something that accommodates advertising. And that was very interesting, that given the option to not use it, plenty of people figured out, gee, I need a form anyway. And you don't just start on page 1 and go to page 60 or whatever, in a row without having any idea where the changes are, where the emphasis are, where the energy goes this way or that way. What about cliffhangers? And it was discovered by a number of seasoned writers that, you know what? I can go back to the tools that I always used without ever calling it a break or having an ad. And what it has to do with the rhythm of experience, that there is I think there may be something biological in the roughly 15-minute span. If you go to a movie in a theater, of which there aren't very many anymore, but if you were to go in a successful movie in a theater, and you observe, you might notice that roughly every 13 to 15 minutes, a little around, the audience squirms. And I've observed this several times, and I think it is actually biological. I think people are looking for a change of pace. They're looking for a cliffhanger. They're looking for something that turns the action in another direction, in what some people have called a plot point, though you don't need to use that terminology. And I think there is something to the rhythm of writing. In fact, if you look at the traditional three-act structure, the old Sid Fields three-act structure, which wasn't invented by Sid Fields, it predates him by a long time, but anyway, that structure said that Act One was 1/4 of the time, Act Two is 2/4 of the time, half, and Act Three is 1/4 of the time. And that's how the three acts work. They're not three even acts. The second act is double. But if you draw a median line down the middle of that second act, which is often where the mid-story character comes in or there's a big change, you've got 4 acts. And so you're still back to the same thing. Now, it plays out differently in 100 minutes than it would in 60 minutes, but not that differently. And so people experiment with what Netflix will tell you and what HBO will tell you is don't talk to me about act breaks. Write what the story needs. Write it whatever length the story needs to be, and we'll deal with it. And I think that's wonderful as a very generous way of approaching writers. The writer still has to go home and structure the story. So what the story needs to be still needs turns, still needs anticipation, still needs what used to be called plot points, still needs a motor that drives to certain kinds of flips, and still needs some sort of resolution. So you find yourself back with some of the most traditional lessons in how to write as you write for even the most advanced television.
So for the outlining process, if we were to tell someone, don't worry about plot structure, that could throw it off. It sounds like this is very necessary.
No, I make my students write very, very structured outlines. They can... I never say don't worry about plot structure. I ask them, what is your story, and where are the turns and twists, and when do they occur? And they'd better know that before they start washing around in a script that's an unknown length, going in unknown directions. So no, that doesn't happen. I believe in what I was taught, which was that you get a locked outline, that you get a really good outline. And if your outline tells the story well, as driven by the characters, and has enough cliffhangers and twists and surprises and anticipation, your script will be easy to write. If you're sweating your script, it's because there was something wrong with the outline.
That'll get a lot of comments because there's of course, there's people very resistant to it. No,
nobody
excellent.
likes to write outlines. Outlines are, with my students, I tell them when the outlines are done, you're out of outline jail, because they're no fun. They don't give you a chance to show off your ability with dialogue or description. They're not beautiful. They're engineering. And creative people might want to resist. Oh no, you're going to, make it too rigid. Actually, it's freeing. It's freeing. If you know where you're going, you can go there very well. If you're lost, you have a hard time making anything work out.
What are the different structures for television?
Television usually exists as half hours, hours, and limited series. Within that, there's some flexibility. The half-hour form, which used to be limited to sitcoms and really isn't anymore, really only runs 20, 22 minutes. It's very short. But how is that divided? Well, some people used to say the comedy structure was, 3 beats up, 3 beats down with a whoops in the middle. I don't think that holds anymore. There are comedies that are in 3-act structure, standard 3-act structure. There are comedies that are in 4-act structure. There are comedies that are, what the heck is going on here? and they can all work because they're propelled by the characters and the kind of material and the kind of humor, if there is humor. Half hours are also not only comedy. More half hours are dramedy now, or what you might call as simply half-hour dramas. And that's different also. If you look at something like Atlanta, which is not bound by legacy structure that it has to fit within a half hour plus ads, which brings it down to like a 20-minute show, you might have a 40-minute episode. And HBO is perfectly happy to have that happen. Coming away from comedy, which is not my specialty, hours are, depends where you look. An hour might be more than an hour on HBO, or might be a full hour and even a little more on HBO or Netflix, or even Amazon. It might be much less than, it might be on legacy television, it's 40-some-odd minutes because they're allowing for the commercials. So it varies. And then the limited series are all different. If you look at something like Ava DuVernay's When You See Us, that's 6 hours, brilliant 6 hours. Most of those hours are 1 hour long, but sometimes I think one of them, if I recall, the beginning one was 2 hours long. And you often see that in the I don't want to say miniseries, in the limited series, you'll often find that one of those hours is a 2-hour segment. They call it special. It's also called as, finishing the show. But are they an hour long? Yeah, mostly, kinda. They have to fit on the schedule. Game of Thrones was often not an hour. It was more. Handmaid's Tale is less because on Hulu it shows with commercials. So if you're working on a show, you have to look at that show and see how they work.
And then Better Call Saul?
Better Call Saul is an AMC, and AMC has commercials, and it certainly has the depth to go for an hour, but it doesn't. It runs more like 50 minutes.
What's the difference between a 5-act and a 6-act structure?
Well, I, first of all, don't really believe in act structures so much anymore. I really like to look at the 4-act structure as a basis, and the 5-act structure is a 4-act structure with the 4th act divided in half. 6 acts sometimes is those 5 acts, and then you add a tag, which is some extra material. But there's also another way of doing it, which is that every act is a little shorter. I don't recommend anybody writing a spec episode in 6 acts. I really think that if somebody out there is watching this, in order to learn how to write a spec sample script, which is required by many of the fellowships, that you should really go with the 4-act plus teaser or no acts at all. The 6-act structure is clumsy because it keeps breaking, first of all, and then also the reader anticipates it's going to be ending, and then, oh, wait a minute, here's another piece. So I don't think anybody should do that.
And so for a first-time spec writer submitting something, should they stick to an hour?
Well, yeah, if they're doing drama, they have to stick to an hour.
They have to, okay.
I mean, if you're a comedy writer, that's different. Then clearly you will write a comedy sample, and that's another world altogether. If it's taped, I mean, if it's multicam, not too many people are doing that anymore. But if it's a multicam sitcom in the old-fashioned sense, it's probably going to be in a different page format as well. You'll look that up. Whereas dramatic scripts and live action filmed comedies look like feature films.
Can you explain A, B, and C stories?
A, B, and C stories are parallel stories that are not subplots. In dramatic shows especially, you will have major full plots that are linked to primary characters. The A story generally has more beats. The B story may have the same number of beats or fewer, and the C story sometimes a runner. It's just a way of thinking about storytelling when you have the kinds of narrative that lap over from episode to episode. So you might have an A story in episode 5, which is actually continues in episode 6 as a B story, and comes back to being an A story in episode 7, and you might have it weaving, so the B story, which is also very important but not the prominent one in episode 5, really has a major turn in episode 6. So you're weaving throughout the season as well as weaving within your episode. That isn't to say the episode can't stand alone, because it should, but that's what parallel storytelling is. It's just multiple narratives. They are not subplots to each other. They are full stories.
Could we try using that with an example of something, maybe Better Call Saul?
Better Call Saul might have Jimmy Saul as the A story. Kim, his wife, might have a separate arc in that show, even though she also intersects with him. But there also might be a story for Nacho, which doesn't even include Saul or Kim, and takes place at it takes place in Mexico. It's in a different place, a different time. Well, the same time usually, but a different location with different characters. They all impact each other, and there's usually a thematic link, but they're actually separate stories in themselves. If you look at the precursor, Breaking Bad, Walter White will have a story. Would Jesse have a separate story with different characters? Maybe. In Breaking Bad, Walter White really was the dominant person. But there are other characters who might have scenes that he isn't in, and might have a number of beats that tell whatever their arc is for that show.
How do you stretch out an idea over multiple episodes without it feeling too drawn out?
You never stretch an idea. There is no such thing as an idea that stretches. There's only a story that needs to be told. If you find that your material is too short, that the story you have does not last for an hour or for whatever length of time, you need to think about your story and who these people are and what more needs to be told. Never stretch and never shrink. I've seen students do things that are just silly, which is to work with the final draft to make more space between letters to make it look bigger, or take out space to make it. That doesn't fool anybody. Plus, it won't work because when you actually make the show, it's going to be the length it is. So that's silly. If you find that you don't actually have enough story, you can do a few things. One is go back into your characters and ask, are there layers of this character that I have not yet examined? Go back into your secondary characters and say, is there more to them? Are they too superficial? Do they have arcs or stories in themselves that could become a B story? Is there a different place to end my story? If it's too short, have I stopped before it really concluded? Or, more likely, have I failed to develop the middle? Generally, people who are lacking material are lacking it in the middle. They think they're lacking it at the end and they need to go on. And that's rarely the truth. Sometimes I have found early scripts that don't start in the right place. The general notion is to start as close to the action as possible, so you want to start as late as possible, but there are a number of instances where you really need to know what caused this story, and they needed to back up and add essentially a whole act for what happened before or what propelled the character. So they were missing something. Never stretch, never fool with it. The idea and the story tells itself.
So a better problem to have is, how can I condense this into this form?
You might say a better problem is how to condense it if you need to hit an hour, if you need to hit 60 minutes. And if it's running too long, there are a few things you can look at. The simplest is, are your dialogue speeches too long? And that's a common error, that people are just simply over-talking, that they say, play it, don't say it, is this something we can see visually instead of explaining it? Or that you've got exposition that needs to go because it's obvious anyway on screen, or because you have indulged in directing on the page or set decoration. So there's just simply too much writing that isn't part of telling the story. So that's an editing thing. Often editing won't, if you're way long, it won't cut enough pages. I mean, if you're up at 75 pages for something that should be 60 pages, editing might not get you there. What may be happening in that case is that you've actually strayed from the focus of your story, or that you even have a whole other character or a whole other storyline that needs to be in a new episode. So those are things you can do if you're running long. In general, or sometimes that your script was really over and you went on. But you'd have to look at it case by case. Unless you're Aaron Sorkin and you're writing something that's normally 70 pages because it's so dialogue rich that it's 70 pages are going to run 60 minutes. But unless you're doing that, and you shouldn't be doing that, you should tighten your script to what works within an hour.
But if your first inclination is, how do I stretch this out, then you know that maybe go back to what your whole idea is even about, because it sounds like there needs to be something.
If your question is, how do I stretch this out, you're asking the wrong question. And you need to go all the way back to who you are as a writer and what is the thing you have to tell.
Does every writer need to know how to write a pilot?
Yes, every writer needs to write a pilot. First of all, it's the coin of the realm, that people meaning agents, producers, even people who are not in the television business, will read a pilot before they will read anything else. In a pilot, they get the originality of your voice and your ability to tell the story and how to write in a shorter amount of time than having to slog through 120 pages of a feature film. So they get all of the same advantage in a shorter reading time. The other thing is that a pilot is likely to show a possible producer or fellowship or agent that you really understand in a compact way how to deliver for today's audience. People watch television, they are not looking at movies, so unless your goal in life is to write episode 900 of some blockbuster action fantasy adventure, you really need to have a pilot for an original show. It doesn't mean that show will be made. It will not be made. But this is your showpiece. This is your masterwork that will then get you the chance to be on the staff of a show, at which point you can then come back to your pilot and maybe then it'll be made. But absolutely, pilot writing is the craft you need. And I would tell any beginning writer that they should have more than one pilot. One pilot isn't enough. For one thing, you learn from every script you write, and you just get better and better. The other is that you may find that after your first pilot, which you thought was the story you had to tell, that there's more to you than that. There are more stories to tell. Generally, shows that get bought are built on underlying material. They're built on books or movies or other underlying assets. So the chance of selling your pilot and getting it made are slight, but it's the thing without which you can't work.
So not just one pilot, but several pilots, and expect them never to be made. This is your sort of calling card. This is your almost resume.
That's right. They might be made. You can hope they'll be made. You never want to say to yourself, this will never be made. But they are evidence of craft. They're evidence of voice. They are who you are as a writer. And who you are should not be one thing. I mean, you can do more than one, and you should. For one thing, they'll get better.
What questions should a writer be asking themselves when they're about to embark on a pilot?
The question to not ask is, how can I imitate something that has already been successful? That's what to not do. I know sometimes people say, well, let me game the business. I saw this work, so I'll do 3% of that and 5% of that, and here, let me do all this, and yeah, I got it, and I'm going to get rich and famous. That doesn't work. What really works is the story that only you can tell. And you, whoever you are, knows that. Generally, writers need to write what hurts. That doesn't mean everything is tragic, but it means you are tapping into what you must say because you have such a great need to say it. Now, that can be interpolated in a way that's not personal. You could do that through history, for example, or even through an imaginary character. It doesn't have to be you, but it needs to be something that you need to convey emotionally and psychologically. And once you know what that is, you can see if there's a way to attach that to something broader than just being your purely personal, intimate tale. And that can be, as I say, political, social, historical. It can be anything you'd like it to be. It can have music, it can have visual material, it can have all sorts of things, but it really needs to come from honesty. And it's anybody who reads a lot of scripts can tell right away if something is dishonest. That is, if something is just trying to make a sale. And it's a turnoff.
What if somebody doesn't want to go there and they say, well, I don't want to?
If you don't want to do that, you shouldn't be a writer. Go do some other job. There are plenty of jobs where you don't have to be introspective or honest in the world. And there are plenty of jobs even in the industry where you don't have to be introspective or honest. But if you want to be a writer, there's a reason you want to write. It's because there's something you want to write about. There's something you want to say. And I think that's your obligation to the universe and to yourself.
How much of the world needs to be created in the pilot?
All of the world and all of the characters are from the writer. You need to know everything. Nothing is for the director to figure out later. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have assets from the actors who will bring depths and insight into the characters that are beyond what you may have imagined. The director may also be able to present a scene in a way that amplifies some elements that you only sketched in. The costumes might add something. The location can add wonderful things. So it's a collaborative field, but the writer is the first dreamer among many dreams, and there's a basis in knowing what you are dealing with here, and that means creating the entire world. By that, I don't mean specifics of the location. The scout will do that. But you need to understand all of the energies which are in this situation that you're going for. And there is no difference between character and world. There are characters that could only exist in the situation where they are, and worlds that will be different depending on the story. Look at all the different medical shows that are not the same medical show. Grey's Anatomy does not look like House, and neither of them looks like ER. They're all medical shows, but they are different worlds because the world comes from who the characters are. Beyond that, world building as an exercise is really not something I would suggest that writers spend a lot of time dealing with. I have seen people make a mistake of going off into fantasy worlds and, decorating characters with feathers and doing things that can only be done with animatronics. And maybe that'll work on some feature films. I think it's a waste of time in television.
Sure. I mean, if we think back to the original Blade Runner, that world was so unique.
Right.
And even if you watch the next Blade Runner, it's still beautiful worlds, but there was something about that original world that just, it was almost impossible to recreate.
Well, if you look at Game of Thrones, which has 7 worlds, actually 7 locations, very, very different, filmed in different countries, whether you're in Northern Ireland or whether you're in some tropical place or a desert. There's absolutely unique and important locations and different sets of characters in each world who express the sense of those worlds. They are all coalesced within a certain time frame, a certain time in life, a sort of medievalish time, and a certain way that people deal with each other. So that was definitely an extreme case of world building. But again, what made Game of Thrones the great success it is? Well, it's because we really were caring about those characters. Yeah, they were great battle scenes, and the worlds were gorgeous, and the costumes were gorgeous. From George R.R. Martin, who wrote the underlying novels, the imagining of the worlds were there from the beginning. So the writer had that from minute one, and then it was just up to everybody else to express that. But no, writers have to do it all. This is your world. This is your characters. This is your dream. This is your story. So nothing's off the hook of, oh, well, the actor will do that or the director will do that. That's not the case. You will do that.